question, why so much violence during Ramadan? And if you go to our website, you'll see we've posted a number of articles, one which documents at least 149 dead during these Ramadan attacks. So we're going to get into that in more detail in the second hour. But the first hour, we are privileged to have with us once again Dr. Rodney Stark, individual that we've had on this program many times before. If you go to my library, you will see lots of Rodney Stark books there. For example, his books on the rise of Christianity, or the triumph of faith, or the triumph of Christianity, the victory of reason, and many others. We've had an opportunity to interview him over the years. He has been in the past a professor at the University of Washington, but now, as we have spent most of our time talking with him, has been a professor at Baylor University, one of the distinguished professors in the social sciences, and also an individual that is the coordinator of the Institute for Studies of Religion. He is the author of this new book, Why God Explaining Religious Phenomenon. Dr. Rodney Stark, always great to have you on the program with us.
Delighted to be here.
Let's, if we can, get into it. Early on, you talk about what you call ungodly theories and scurrilous metaphors, and I can think of a few. One is that Karl Marx told us that religion is the opiate of the people. Sigmund Freud tells us that the only reason we even believe in God is kind of a wish fulfillment. So talk about some of those metaphors, because as a sociology professor, you certainly have looked at those and recognize how those have been influential in Western culture.
Yeah, well, it's an amazing thing. I suppose it's no surprise that professional atheists, whether they're professors of sociology or just sitting in the British Museum writing the Communist Manifesto, is that people like this would have crazy notions, if you will, about what religion is. The idea is that it's neurosis, it's poor people wanting to be rich, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Anything but about a faith based on belief in God or in the supernatural. But there were a whole bunch of other social scientists who somehow couldn't handle the notion that God was part of religion at all. At least Marx knew that people who were religious believed in God. Many sociologists actually denied that and thought that it was about society worshiping itself. It was all about social integration. And so they would consider as religions things like the Communist Party, the Nazi Party, just about anything that came along that had to do with kind of an overarching ultimate belief system of any kind. That's silly. A godless religion is really like an army without arms. I mean, it's pointless. And the fact is that you don't have to even be a believer to realize that the proper definition of religion has to do fundamentally with belief in God. And then you build on that and see where it goes.
You know, one of the things that's interesting, and of course this moves away from your academic world, but the world I find myself in sometimes when I go onto campuses or in other forums where we'll be engaged in a debate with the so-called new atheists. And the argument I'm getting from a lot of atheists now is that really atheism is the default setting. If it weren't for all you religious people out here teaching about religion, then everybody would probably grow up being an atheist. But your book and really just human experience tells me that people believe that life has meaning. People believe that there is something beyond just the physical. People believe in a God. And I think the difficulty that the new atheists have is that we're an incorrigibly religious people, even in the 21st century. 2 billion people call themselves Christians, 1.5 billion call themselves Muslims, another billion various Eastern religions, probably another billion animists. We're pretty religious for this argument that atheism is just sort of the default value, don't you think?
Oh, well, of course. And the interesting thing is that some of the professional atheists, like Dawkins, for example, are fully aware of this and actually even admit it in a sense. They say, in order for life to have meaning, you have to believe in a God. Therefore, their point is that life obviously really has no meaning, that you have to get used to it. You have to realize that life is just a meaningless accident that happened, because otherwise you have to believe in a creator in order who gave some meaning to life, who gave a purpose to it. And Dawkins is perfectly upfront about this. It's a lot of more ignorant atheists who don't seem to get the point. But there's an interesting feature hiding behind all of this. Many of the professional atheists, new atheists who will, including Richard Dawkins, deny the existence of God and then turn around and have what I would call science fiction gods.
Bingo. Yes.
Well, I mean, Dawkins says, the fact is that out there somewhere in the universe, there are races that are so advanced that they would seem like gods to us. Well, that's a belief in something that's never been seen, never been realized. And it's hard for me to see how it's silly to believe in God, but it's okay to believe in aliens who are like gods. I mean, come on, they're both acts of faith.
I would say so. And part of it may be the desire to not have a creator that can affect my life. Because one of the things that I've run into over the years is people borrowing from Sigmund Freud say, well, the reason you believe in God is because you wish there was a God. And I just turn it around on them, and they never see this coming, Dr. Stark, where I'll just say, oh, well, it's also possible that because you don't want there to be a God and you don't want to be the possibility that there's a moral order to the universe, you want to deny the existence of God. And so in some respects, that's the issue. I don't really want to believe there's a God because it might constrain my sexuality, for example.
Exactly. I mean, that really was where Freud was coming from. The notion that, what he really hated was the idea of sin. The notion that there's right and wrong. There really isn't right and wrong. There are things that are, but then you turn around, of course, believing in God was wrong. So I don't know where you come out.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a break. When we come back, I want to continue our conversation. This is a book. It's published by Templeton Press, and we have a link so that you can order it. We have information about Rodney Stark there as well. We have also some great material that we will be talking about a little bit later that you might want to download. And when we come back, I want to answer a question, because we oftentimes say that religion really helps sustain the moral order. Well, not exactly. Not all religions do. Some do. I don't think you'll be surprised by some of our answers, but maybe a little bit, and we'll get into that. And then we'll talk about some of the other issues related to religion and society. We'll get into miracles and magic and a variety of other topics. It's all part of this book, Why God? It is written by Dr. Rodney Stark, author of the book The Rise of Christianity and many others, explaining religious phenomena. We'll continue our conversation with him right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the special election in Montana illustrated the problems with early voting. Greg Gianforte may have won his election to Congress simply because so many people voted before he body slammed Guardian staff writer Ben Jacobs. Although we have the audio tape of what took place, there is still some question about what may have precipitated the angry outburst and violent act. That can be a conversation for another day. I want to focus on the problems with early voting. Many of the voters in Montana wanted their ballots back after this episode so they could change their vote. Too bad they voted before this late-breaking story. It is quite possible that early voting guaranteed the win for Greg Gianforte. Over the years, we have made it easier and easier for people to vote early. Some states allow voters to cast their ballots before they have all the information they need to make the informed choice. In North Carolina last year, voters could begin casting ballots more than 2 weeks before the first presidential debate. That should not happen. Years ago, I wrote about some of the other problems with early voting. John Funn points out in his book, Stealing Elections, that early voting and loose absentee laws make voter fraud easier. He acknowledged that voters love no-excuse absentee voting for its convenience, but he adds that absentee voting makes it easier to commit election fraud because the ballots are cast outside of the supervision of election officials. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement concluded that the lack of in-person at-the-polls accountability makes absentee ballots the tool of choice for those inclined to commit fraud. The problem with early voting in Montana should be a wake-up call to the nation. Events and revelations in the final weeks of a campaign should make a difference to the voters who appear all too willing to cast their votes before all the relevant information is in. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about religion today with Dr. Rodney Stark. His book is entitled Why God? Explaining Religious Phenomena. It's almost 300 pages long. It is published by Templeton Press. You can find it in your local bookstore perhaps, but we always recognize that because some of these books are a little more academic in nature, we've made it very easy for you to order it either through Amazon or also we have a link to Templeton Press, so you can find out more about that by going to our website, pointofview.net. Dr. Stark, let's for just a minute talk about this issue, because we've heard for many years that religion really helps sustain the moral order. People have a sense of right and wrong, and especially if they believe that there's more to life than life, that would be significant as well. But one of the things you point out is not all religions are the same. That is, not all religions function to sustain the moral order. Can you explain?
Well, sure. It depends on your conception of God. I mean, all of the people who wrote in the early textbooks that God, religion sustains the moral order, had classical educations and should have known better. If you look back, you see the gods of Greece and ancient Greece and Rome clearly, as one of my colleagues pointed out, were unedifying examples. I mean, they cheated, they lied, they fornicated, they did all kinds of awful things, and they clearly didn't care what people did to one another, as long as the proper feasts were made for them. That kind of a religion can't possibly be supporting the moral order. And there are lots of other religions that don't have this moral aspect. You have to have a conscious God, conception of God as conscious and aware, and secondly, a God that has moral concerns. And if you don't have that, then religion doesn't play any role. So today, for example, if you look at survey data and various ways of checking to see if religious people are less likely to break the law, you find that, in fact, that's quite strongly supported in Christian nations. That is to say, the more people are concerned about God, the more actively religious they are, the less likely they are to have been arrested or to agree with statements about it's okay to buy stolen goods and that sort of thing. It of course, works in Islam. The God of Islam has moral concerns. We may not always like them, but there are strong moral concerns. But when you get into Asia, into Confucianism and Buddhism and whatnot, you don't have that conception of God. And in fact, the religious people in Asia are no less likely to break the law than are the irreligious people. The people who go to a Confucian temple once a week are no more likely to, less likely to approve of buying stolen goods, for example, than people who never go.
Interesting.
So it depends on what kind of religion you have as to whether it has these moral aspects.
And again, for a lot of our listeners that maybe saw Wonder Woman this weekend, I mean, the premise there is you learn about one of the gods, Artemis, and it's just one of the many gods. But you point out that the Sumerians worship 50 different gods, Egyptians 450, the Greeks 300. But as you point out, they were just full of human defects. They thirsted, they hungered, they lied, they stole, they murdered, they envied, they hated, they loved, they lusted, as you point out in the book. And so religion itself doesn't maintain the religious order or the moral order, but those, and primarily the religions of the book, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, even if we may disagree with our Muslim friends, we'll get into that in the second hour, at least there's a moral order. There's a right and wrong. There's a standard. There is a judgment. And those kinds of things really have been very significant in Western culture, haven't they? Right.
And by the way, in India, Hinduism is not well understood, in the West. But it, in fact, is quite a moral religion. And it has strong moral effects. If nothing else, you go to hell by being born being born poor, for example, in the next life. I mean, it is a religion that has a serious moral code attached to it.
Well, again, one of the things you've also pointed out is that as we see a degradation, and now maybe I'm playing off a little of your Institute for Studies of Religion, then if you don't have a sufficient view of God, and more people are writing about how the mainline denominations no longer have an orthodox view of Christianity. No surprise there. But also because of that, it causes the culture to degrade, because on the one hand, Dr. Stark, you'll have some people say, well, still a lot of people going to church. Yes, but it's what is taught in those churches, and more importantly, what's in the heads of the individuals, which is why we're seeing a real decline in morality here in America, because it isn't just the rise of the nuns, the people that say none of the above, atheist, agnostic, no belief, but it's also the rise of others that are becoming more like, say, the mainline churches, which don't necessarily have a proper view of God in the Bible. Fair?
Yeah, this is all very complicated, of course. For one thing, take the NONES. I have to spell it out because otherwise it's confusing. People think I'm talking about sisters.
Yes.
The nuns, the vast majority of nuns are not at all irreligious. What they're really saying is, I don't belong to a local church. Because you also ask them how often they pray, and most of them do pray, and pray significantly frequently. Most of them believe in life after death. Most of them believe in God. So I don't know what they're none about, other than I'm not going to a local church. And that's important, but it's not the same thing as being atheists. And it's very, very irresponsible, at least for some of these polling agencies, to suggest to the media that that's who they are. And the other thing is, you notice what's happening to these liberal denominations that get Paul Tillich's conception of God, which is to say a non-existent God, a name only, and that is that they're going broke. They've lost membership incredibly, and these people didn't go home and stay home. They just went somewhere else for the religion. But the fact of the matter is that these big denominations have an enormous effect in the public sphere, if you will. They're the ones the media look to for various things, and they are, as you say, have become increasingly, as they've lost sight of God, if you will, as they've started presenting God as a less and less conscious, aware being. They've also become much, much more loose morally, if you will, as my grandfather would have said.
For sure.
But that is an important thing, and it's unfortunate.
Well, and one of the other things we do on Wednesdays, Dr. Stark, is we spend some time doing a millennial roundtable, and we're going to have that this Wednesday. And actually, we've got two of our major participants back with us, and so that will be a great opportunity. But when you look at some of the research done by Christian Smith, and I know you followed him up there at Notre Dame, what he said is we see as time goes on, this younger generation, this emerging generation, they're moving away from kind of an evangelical orthodoxy to what would be kind of a deistic, therapeutic moralism, or kind of almost like a mainline denominational kind of theology, aren't they?
Except I don't know how we know that. Let me tell you something that really bothers me, because I've been talking about this for decades. Way back when, and I mean way back when, we said, young people are leaving the church. Oh, my Lord. We're talking about the 60s now, or in the 70s.
Right.
How are we going to get them back into the church? And this has happened year after year after year after year, and church attendance has never gone down. Why is that? And the fact is that any given year since there have been polls of people, public opinion polls, you will find that people under 30 are considerably less likely to go to church than older people.
Sure.
But there are two possibilities here. One is that it is a generational change, or two, that it's an age effect. And for the last 50 years, it's turned out every time there was an age effect, that people under 30 sleep in on Sunday morning, then they get married, they get kids, and they go to church. And so this millennial flight is something, maybe it's going on, but it's been said to have been going on for the last 50 years, and it wasn't.
Good. Let me take a break, and we'll come back, and we have a lot more to cover, because you have some chapters dealing with miracles and the idea of revelation and a variety of other topics. By the way, along the way, you probably just want to listen, but if there's a comment or two that you'd like to respond to or ask a question, you're welcome to do that as well. That number is 1-800-351-1212. Otherwise, sit back, and as we continue our conversation with Dr. Rodney Stark, we'll talk about this very important book, Why God? All that coming up right after this.
Today, Robert Jeffress is the pastor of the massive First Baptist Church of Dallas, and his preaching is seen and heard around the world on Pathway to Victory. He first heard of Point of View as a seminary student and credits the program with developing a fuller understanding of his calling as a pastor.
I have to believe that Point of View and their courageous stand for the truth of God's Word certainly helped me to understand my role as a pastor was to not just preach ivory tower sermons that are divorced from reality, but to look at the world through the lens of Scripture and see how God's Word applies to today's world.
Your support of Point of View makes everything possible, reaching people, inspiring ministries, spreading truth literally around the world. But none of that happens until you make the call or visit us online and join the Truth Team. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Now is the time. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Rodney Stark. He is the author of the book, Why God? Explaining Religious Phenomena. And for just a few minutes, Dr. Stark, let's look at that subtitle, because in Chapter 3, you talk about religious experiences, miracles, and revelations. And my point here is not to have a debate about the existence of miracles. Or first of all, most of our listeners are Christians, and my argument usually is that God has probably performed more miracles than we give him credit for. But the point you're making here, and as your fellow sociologists might just discount all that, they've read David Hume and they think there are no miracles. The truth is that a lot of Americans have experiences, miracles that they can point to, revelations, insights that actually increase their faith. And so this is something that oftentimes the secular sociologists haven't really acknowledged, but your book really begins to delve into that in quite a bit of detail, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing here is that in the first instance, the people who blocked research on this were theologians at the liberal seminaries. Back when I was a very young man, graduate student, I was enormously lucky in that I got to design and basically control the first major national surveys of American religion that were ever done.
Right.
And when I was building these, I was talking to various church members and, interviewing them and whatnot to get a feel for what I should be doing. And I kept running across religious experiences.
Yes.
And so I built a bunch of items to measure a sense of having had contact with God in various ways, because I thought this was very important and that it had been completely neglected by the social sciences. And the director of the center that I was working at, a good guy, but he had enlisted some seminary professors, theologians, if you will, I'll not mention their names, as advisors. And when they hit those items, they went nuts.
Yes.
They said these things are insulting, they're ludicrous, only lunatics would ever have such things, and basically I had to take them all out. Yeah. Then I managed to get a couple of just weak items back in, like I've sometimes felt in the presence of God.
Right.
I managed to get it in. So we went out and we did the surveys, and we come back as about 70% of the respondents said, oh, yeah, I have sometimes felt the presence of God. And I thought, yeah, right. You liberals, you theologians, you don't know anything about American religion. But it was many, many years before I was able to get items of that kind that had been cut into some national surveys, and they were incredible results. For example,
the 2007 Baylor survey.
Yeah. Well, listen. Here's an item.
Okay.
I have been saved from harm by a guardian angel. 52% said yes.
There you go.
Now, the Richard Dawkins types would immediately say, sure, but that's just a figure of speech. They didn't really mean that some guardian angel came down and saved them. It means that they had good luck. I don't think that's so, because, as a matter of fact, almost everybody believes in angels. They believe that angels are active. Several times I've at press conferences on other things, but I've thrown away this line about this is 52% and guardian angels. And afterwards, people start sneaking up to me, media people saying, it happened to me.
Yes.
Well, now, just a second. It's interesting. But, when you go out and you ask about miraculous healings, well, 16, 17 to 20% of Americans in survey after survey say, yeah, it's happened to me, and I've seen these things happen.
Right.
And then you find that 60 or 70% of Americans have participated in prayer groups for the ill, these prayer chain things and whatnot. And there's an enormous amount of activity and faith and stuff going on out there that has simply been ignored. So I refuse to ignore it, and I keep scraping up little pieces here and pieces there and trying to theorize and trying to put it all together. And the fact of the matter is that religious experiences are a major part of the life of Christians in the United States, and it's very important to their faith. There's nothing to convince a person that their faith is right than to think that a miracle has happened. And, every time you measure it this way or that way, there are an awful lot of people who say, it has happened. I have observed it. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, necessarily that it really happened. I mean, I can't prove that. But there's no reason. We certainly have to say that a whole bunch of otherwise apparently intelligent and normal people believe it has happened to them.
And I think that's the point, because the argument is basically, well, it's not happening because I haven't studied it, or that, or because Martin Marty decided to throw it out back in 1963.
That's right. You mentioned the name, I didn't. But,
well, that's fine. I was going to a liberal church across the street in Berkeley, interestingly enough, in 1963 when you were at the Survey Research Center, and I know some of the people that were deciding not to ask those questions. So in some respects, I have a lot more connection to that than you might have thought. But
that's marvelous. Yes, indeed.
But again, that was the mindset. This is just some folklore. This is something that's not worth studying, not research. Yeah.
Sure, reasonable people don't believe this stuff, and that's just. It's like the two professors at one of those Berkeley seminaries who told me that their main job with first-year seminary students was to knock all that Youth for Christ stuff out of them. We got to get rid of their belief before we can make preachers out of them.
Yeah,
that seems to me a little bit strange and sad, yes.
But
yes,
again, some of those numbers, again, I witnessed a miraculous physical healing, 23%. I received a miraculous physical healing, 16%. If you travel at all in religious circles, of course you and I do, so we know that we hear those stories all the time. And then for the secular sociologist to say, well, they don't exist, well, you never studied them and you never did any surveys on them, and the very few people that do show that what we have are more than just anecdotes. I mean, we can give you some...
it's like when I... threw away this line at a press conference, and a woman who was with one of the networks took me aside and said, when I was very pregnant, I stepped off a curb and started to fall. I was grabbed by the shoulders, put back on the curb, and there was nobody there. Now, I can't say that happened as she said it, but she certainly believed it.
Heard all the stories, and it's amazing how many of them will tell me the stories in the studio with the microphones off because they don't want to say them on the air. Because, but
sure, that's right, and that's partly why we don't know more about it.
Yes. Let me get to one other issue because you have so many great chapters. That one, of course, on miracles and revelation. But chapter 4 talks about this idea of conversion because, again, you have this kind of secular mindset that a few people have some kind of conversion and change, but it's due to some crisis in their life. And I'm not denying that at all. But talk about what you've studied as well in terms of this issue of religious conversion.
Well, the thing is, we've always thought that people converted for ideological reasons. And what I've found is that they convert for social reasons, that the ideology then follows. And that doesn't mean that it's insincere or anything less than authentic, but people tend to join religions if their friends and family have joined those religions. And then afterwards, they'll say, this was exactly what I was looking for, but I didn't know it. I have a whole huge survey from China, with 7,000 respondents. Mm-hmm. And as you know, Christianity is growing like mad in China.
Yes.
And what you find is if you ask people, what was your first contact with Christianity? How'd you come in contact with it? It was never with clergy. It was always family, always neighbors. It was social. And And that's not really a surprise. I mean, when we make all kinds of life decisions, we turn to our friends for advice and for information. And they say, this is working for me, and so it's working for you. I mean, that's all in a certain sense when the Bible tells you to go out and convert the nations. That's how it happens. People go out and do convert their friends and neighbors.
That's right. And if nothing else, an application point is, if you invite people to church 3 out of every 4 times, they'll come with you. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Governor Bill Haslam of Tennessee has signed into law a measure protecting the religious liberty of Tennessee's student athletes. The new law allows parents to opt their students out of participation in an athletic contest if the event is on an official school holiday, observed day of worship, or religious holiday. Moreover, it sets the authority aright by explaining that school officials may not require a student to attend an athletic event over the parent's objection. Some wonder how necessary such a measure is. They argue that schools already respect the religious choices of student athletes and do not punish those students who, for religious reasons, sit out of scheduled contests. That, I suppose, is a debate for the ages. Whether athletes should participate on holy days is not a new issue. Just watch the classic movie Chariots of Fire as but one example. Nonetheless, it is good to see the state of Tennessee explicitly stating that its school districts should be mindful that there are things to be respected of higher importance than sports. Athletics can teach students much about life, diligence, and teamwork. But life balance is a critical element taught by sports in school as well. Today's student athletes are tomorrow's business leaders who may be required to accommodate the religious practices of employees. Let us hope they learn the delicate balance of freedom well. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Rodney Stark with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Why God? Explaining Religious Phenomenon. And Dr. Stark, for just a minute, I want to maybe also pull some from your previous book, The Rise of Christianity. The subtitle, How the Obscure Marginal Jesus Movement Became the Dominant Religious Force in the Western World in a Few Centuries. Because even in this book, you have that growth. But talk about church growth for just a minute, because it seems to me that the reason Christianity was so successful is because believers, first of all, believed it. They were very persistent in the midst of very slow growth in the midst of great persecution. And today we're seeing this explosive growth of Christianity in some of these places where persecution takes place, like China and Muslim countries and the rest. But what have you learned in looking at, even in the first few centuries of Christianity and even today in the 20th and 21st century in terms of church growth?
Well, the thing about Christian growth is I hate to use this word, but it has to do with payoffs. Christianity is very attractive, and it works. When people convert, they find their lives are better. And consequently, they go and tell their friends and relatives, my life just got better. And their friends and neighbors try it, and it's gone on like this for a couple of thousand years, and it continues. And that's one of the really remarkable. By the way, if you want to talk about church growth, people are always worried about the fact that somehow American religion is supposedly going down, which it never has. Church attendance is as high as it's ever been. Church membership is higher than it's ever been. And we recently discovered it's much higher than we thought it was. People have been saying all along that people lie to the pollsters when they say they belong to a church, because there are a group of people who do a survey, a census of church membership every 10 years, and they come up with a lot fewer church members than you get if you project the poll results into the population. The problem is, we discovered, is that the so-called census isn't a census. What it is a working through of the annual reports of various denominations, of which there are many denominations that don't issue an annual report, or that these people don't get. So what we discovered, quite accidentally, here in McClendon County in Texas, which is one of the highest church membership counties in America, we discovered that the census report for McClendon County only reported 60% of the churches that are in McClendon County. That's say we found all kinds of churches that weren't included in the census. We found something else. These weren't little storefronts. One of the churches that wasn't included has got 4,000 members.
Wow.
So, I mean, it's a big one. Well, we decided, was this peculiar to a highly church county like McClendon? So we had someone do it in Bellingham, Washington, in a county that's very low on church membership.
Right.
Well, again, we found the same level of error we found in McClendon County. So we tried it again in Maryland. Same result. Tried it again in Ohio. In other words, the poll data are right and the census data are wrong. America is very highly churched. And if you, as a comparison, remember, in 1776, about 17 or 18% of Americans actually belonged to a church only. By mid-19th century, that had gotten up to about 30%. By the turn of the 20th century, it was about half. Now it's about 70%. And this is partly due to the fact that we have so many churches, and that if you're going to prosper as a church, you've got to go out there and dig and find yourself some members. And that makes for a highly churched population, because if it's possible to get people to go to church, somebody's going to get you to go.
Yes. One other one I just wanted to cover real quickly, we don't have a lot of time, is this idea of pluralism and civility. You know, we've always heard from the secular people that Christians are narrow-minded and intolerant. I think now we're starting to see that when those that are secularists are in control, they can be very intolerant of Christians. But your argument is pluralism actually works pretty well in these monotheistic religions like Christianity. The idea of affirming your right to hold that belief, even if I disagree with that belief, is really something that's part of Western culture, and a lot of it is rooted into a Judeo-Christian view, isn't it?
Yeah, well, and the other thing that is really nice about it is that it creates religion versions of Christianity that are a good fit for people. Not everybody has the same taste. Not everybody has the same needs or the same desires religiously speaking. When there are a lot of denominations out there, they're going to differ a lot, and they're going to appeal to different people. And the result is that there is a form of good Christianity available for just about anybody. And that's not true of the Monopoly Church. You can't be both very strict and very lax. You can't be both very otherworldly oriented and very worldly. You can't be both wet and dry, if you will.
Yeah.
And
high church and contemporary, all those kind of things,
But when you've got a great variety, you've got something appropriate for everybody, and it works much better.
Well, we're just about out of time. Let me just mention that if people would like more information, we do have a link so that people can get a copy of this from the Templeton Press. If people would want to contact you at the Institute for Studies of Religion or find out a little bit more about Baylor University, how can they do so?
Well, obviously, you can just go to Baylor University online and trample all over the place. You can visit the Institute for Studies of Religion. You can look in all kinds of nooks and crannies of Baylor University online. You can find me at rodneystark.com.
Well, good. I appreciate you giving us an opportunity to talk about this new book. And again, I would commend to a lot of people your book, The Rise of Christianity, How the Obscure Marginal Jesus Movement Became the Dominant Religious Force in the Western World in a Few Centuries. Of course, also The Triumph of Faith, The Triumph of Christianity, The Victory of Reason, and much, much more. So, Dr. Rodney Stark, always appreciate your time, and thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the latest terrorist attack in London, but also look a little deeper at what about all of these various attacks that have taken place during Ramadan. This takes place during the 9th lunar month, and it is a time you would think when there would be less of these kinds of attacks, and yet they still continue. So we're going to spend some time looking at that issue, and we have posted a couple of articles about this as well. We also have had kind of the hue and cry that has come because the United States decided, at least through President Trump, to disconnect from the Paris Climate Accord. What about that? We have an article that is related to that as well. And also just the great concern and blowback, if you will, because of some of the things that have been happening over the last couple of weeks, and in particular, severed heads of Donald Trump and others being posted. So we're going to spend some time getting into all sorts of issues. And in the second hour, we certainly want to open up the phones and give you a chance to join our conversation. So that number is 1-800-351-1212. If you have some opinions or some thoughts about how to address this issue of terrorism, both in the UK and in the United States, and how to bring a level of civility back to our political discourse, we certainly welcome your phone calls. Let's take a break. We will come back and spend some time getting back into the news cycle. All that happens right after this.
A 2013 survey asked people around the world whether sex without marriage is morally wrong. Every country where more than 90% said, yes, it's morally wrong, Islamic. The worst two, tied at 6% saying it's wrong, France and Germany, the nations of Calvin and Luther. Catholic Italy, 11%. Simply sad. The United States, well, 31%. Not even 1 in 3 thinks extramarital sex is morally wrong. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We're going to talk about the attack again in London. This is the third major attack, and of course, just before the election there, and whether it will have some impact remains to be seen. We'll also want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the violence in the streets and even some of the actions by Kathy Griffin, whether or not that might have an impact. So we'll look at that. Of course, you've also had an interview that was done with Vladimir Putin. Who would have guessed that would be an interview that we might be talking about? And then some reaction as well to the decision by President Donald Trump to remove the United States from the Paris Climate Accord. So those are just a few of the issues we want to put on the table this hour, but this will be an open line. So if there's some other issues you'd like to address, we certainly do welcome your phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. Let me set the scene for just a minute. This is a piece that came out of The Guardian, and I think it illustrates just how bizarre some of this is. Here you have this jihadi who was dressed in Arsenal shirt, and he was basically euphoric and asking his neighbor about whether or not he could hire a van. This is just hours before this tragedy and this atrocity at the London Bridge. He could not even contain his excitement, it says, during the conversation with a neighbor on Saturday afternoon. The neighbor said he wandered over, asked about his van and how much it would cost to hire it. This is a man, by the way, who was a father of two. He's worked at KFC. He's worked at the Transport for London, which is responsible for the tube, the subway, and the buses in the capital, and yet then goes on this bloody rampage with two other extremists that left, at that time, 7. Now, of course, the death toll has increased, dead, and then, of course, these individuals shot by the police. And so you can see that this is something that is just so bizarre, but nevertheless is exactly what we seem to be dealing with these days when we talk about London. Now, in a statement released through the news agency, ISIS, that would be the Islamic State, said that the assailants were a detachment of Islamic State fighters. Then authorities in central London confirmed 7 victims had been killed, at least 48 hospitalized. The 3 attackers shot dead by the police. 21 of the victims remained in critical condition as the last report, which is probably old, but that's the best one I had at the moment. And then, of course, you have the statements that come from, for example, the mayor of London, who is saying, even though there's a lot of police out here, don't be too concerned or don't be too alarmed. Well, I would be if that many police were out there. Theresa May, of course, a statement as well calling for counterterrorism measures and the rest. And so there's a lot that we can certainly cover. But we want to put this in some kind of context. I can spend some time talking about what happened in London, but let me talk about this in a broader way, because the first article that we have here gives you a little bit of this coverage of what happened in London. It gives you some footage so that you can, if you want, I don't recommend it, but if you would want to see some of the video interactions, that's the second article on our website, or the first full article after the one on the interview we did last hour. And then we have one which I wanted to post as well that comes from the Daily Caller. 149 dead so far in these Ramadan attacks. Now, this is an important issue to recognize because Ramadan, as you may know, is celebrated during the 9th lunar month. It is a time of fasting. That is, a Muslim, especially an obedient Muslim, is to fast from really sunrise to sunset during the daylight hours from a number of different activities. They're able to eat afterwards. But this has been something which has been considered kind of a holy month. But it has been, if nothing else, something that has illustrated how, if you will, dangerous the month of Ramadan has been. And this particular article talks about these attacks, of course, that we're talking about in London. But let me move beyond that for just a minute and say also that there have been a number of other major attacks. For example, there were twin suicide bombings in Baghdad, a massive suicide vehicle bomb in Afghanistan, then an unconfirmed terrorist incident, and even when they're unconfirmed, we know what they are, which happened in a casino hotel in Manila. And these all, I think, illustrate, along with what happened on London Bridge, that this holy month for Islam has become a terrorist month as well. Let me kind of go through some of them real quickly. The Baghdad bombing targeted both an ice cream shop and an elderly pension distribution center. The ice cream shop, frequented again by families with lots of small children, killed 10 there. The first bombing killed 12 and nearly 100 were injured in these two different blasts there in Baghdad. Then you have a second bombing in Afghanistan, killed nearly 100 people and injured hundreds more. This was a massive suicide vehicle. It struck one of the safest areas in Kabul in Afghanistan, actually destroyed parts of the German embassy. Several German and U.S. citizens were killed in the attack, and Afghan officials believe that the Taliban may be responsible in that particular case. Then you have the one in Manila. That happened on Friday, where a gunman stormed a casino hotel resort there in Manila and then set fire to a hotel while attempting to steal $2 million in gaming chips. And again, ISIS claimed responsibility for that particular killing, which killed nearly 40 people. And so this raises a very good question, which our friend Jim Dennison, I think, does a very good job of illustrating. Why so much violence during Ramadan? And Jim Dennison, Dr. Jim Dennison, has been on the program with us before. Nick Pitts works with him, and he will be with us on Wednesday. Said last night ISIS claimed responsibility for the London attack that killed 7 and wounded 48. One of the terrorists wore a fake bomb vest. According to ABC News, the vest was likely intended to guarantee a police response that would lead to his martyrdom. He was a father of a toddler, as I mentioned just a minute ago. His wife was expecting a child. What would motivate him, Jim Dennison asked, to carry out such an atrocity at the cost of his own life? And he says the day of the attack, an ISIS message called on its followers to use knives, guns, and vehicles in an all-out war on infidels during Ramadan. The audio message instructed jihadists to attack them in their homes, their markets, their roads, and their forums. And Jim Dennison points out that when Ramadan began this year, jihadists attacked a bus filled with Christians in Egypt, murdering 29. 10 of the victims were children. The day after Ramadan began, you have the suicide bomber killing 18 people in Afghanistan, 2 of them as children, which I just mentioned. And last year's Ramadan was the bloodiest on record. You have the gunman who killed 49 and wounded 53 in an Orlando gay nightclub. An Islamist then stabbed a police officer and his wife in Paris, then claimed he was responding to ISIS' call for violence during Ramadan. And later that month, 3 ISIS suicide bombers killed 45 and wounded 250 in Istanbul's main airport. When Ramadan ended last year, the final global body count was 421 dead, 729 wounded. We're going to spend some time talking about that, but we also want to take some of your phone calls. If you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the special election in Montana illustrated the problems with early voting. Greg Gianforte may have won his election to Congress simply because so many people voted before he body slammed Guardian staff writer Ben Jacobs. Although we have the audio tape of what took place, there is still some question about what may have precipitated the angry outburst and violent act. That can be a conversation for another day. I want to focus on the problems with early voting. Many of the voters in Montana wanted their ballots back after this episode so they could change their vote. Too bad they voted before this late-breaking story. It is quite possible that early voting guaranteed the win for Greg Gianforte. Over the years, we have made it easier and easier for people to vote early. Some states allow voters to cast their ballots before they have all the information they need to make the informed choice. In North Carolina last year, voters could begin casting ballots more than 2 weeks before the first presidential debate. That should not happen. Years ago, I wrote about some of the other problems with early voting. John Funn points out in his book, Stealing Elections, that early voting and loose absentee laws make voter fraud easier. He acknowledged that voters love no-excuse absentee voting for its convenience, but he adds that absentee voting makes it easier to commit election fraud because the ballots are cast outside of the supervision of election officials. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement concluded that the lack of in-person at-the-polls accountability makes absentee ballots the tool of choice for those inclined to commit fraud. The problem with early voting in Montana should be a wake-up call to the nation. Events and revelations in the final weeks of a campaign should make a difference to the voters who appear all too willing to cast their votes before all the relevant information is in. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go. For Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Talking about some of these attacks on Ramadan. Let me take some phone calls first. And I believe we're heading to Australia. Someone listening on YouTube. So, John, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yep. Hello. How are you?
Very good. What would you like to ask? Thank you for joining us today.
I was just wondering your opinion on nigga.
Okay. Well, we'll simply just go on there. I'm not sure we got through on that one. That's a problem with Australia, so we'll just have to live on that one. Let me see if I can get another phone call here. We'll go to North Carolina. Steve, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you, sir. I surely enjoy your program.
Thank you.
I got a question. Why don't the free world let these terrorist organizations know that from now on we're going to put pork on tips of certain bullets? When we shoot your terrorist, they're not going to know which bullet it is that's being shot, but it will condemn their souls in their terms to hell.
Well, and again, there are stories that have been told about that, in the past, others. First of all, we honor people's religious commitment, even if they're going to kill people. But I do wonder if in some of these other countries where we don't honor religious traditions, maybe in Chechnya or Russia or something like that, whether something like that would happen, because there seems to need to be some kind of deterrence. And as we just pointed out a minute ago, there wasn't much of a deterrence for this individual because, after all, he apparently strapped on a fake bomb vest to guarantee that he would be killed and that he would be martyred. And so there is this mindset that you need to be martyred in order to gain assurance of salvation. And so it seems to me that that's one of those kinds of things that we need to figure out how to create more deterrence. But I ultimately believe that the real answer is ideological. We just have got to get more of those people that are, if you will, moderate Muslims to begin to speak out against this, because if we don't, and if we don't have some kind of deterrence, we're going to end up with an armed camp. And so I've heard of individuals talking about this, that one of the ways supposedly that John Persing discouraged Muslim terrorists was to bury their bodies with pigs. Now, it turns out that's not the case, but you have heard people over the years talk about using pork-laced bullets in one way or another to use that as a deterrence. I know we would never do that. I know that in London they would never do that, but we've got to come up with something that's going to be a better deterrent than what we've got right now, don't you think?
Yes, sir, very much so. Let me ask you another question, if I could.
Sure, go ahead.
I'd understand from a guy, I can't remember his name, he wrote a book, The Barbarians Are Here.
Oh, sure.
Have you heard of that book?
Michael Yosef, we've had him on this program.
Michael Yosef.
Yes.
That's where I heard of that.
Yes, it's been on
Why
this
is
program.
not our government doing something about those training camps here in our country?
Well, we keep bringing that up. We've talked about that with Michael Yosef. We've talked about that with the Christian Action Network and some others. And if you type in some of those key words like that, you can find out a little bit more. We do need to get something more than local police, because the arguments I've heard from people that have done the research on this are that the sheriff department may know that there's a training camp, but they're not going to go in as a local sheriff's department and try to deal with that. This is something that really needs to be dealt with at least at the National Guard level or at the federal level. So that's where I think we need to educate some of our governors and maybe even educate the president and vice president about some of this.
They're calling them some other form of compound. My daughter looked it up in Tennessee because she lives in Tennessee. She said it's not a training camp. It's something they called the name of the compound. I said, Stephanie, it's a training camp.
Yes, and I appreciate the fact that you know about that. We have done programs on it, and I'll tell you what, since you brought it up, Steve, we'll try to bring it up again. How's that?
I appreciate it, and I'll certainly call my state senator and congressman and see if they can't get Trump while he's in office to do something about that. And I'm sorry it got started back when they let all these paramilitary groups within our country get by.
Well, appreciate it.
That was one of the downfalls.
Steve, thank you for calling in today. Let me, just before we take a break here, finish my point, and I'll get some more phone calls. By the way, that does open up a line or two if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. But you might say, okay, you've already told us that there were at least, and the best numbers we have on the article we've posted here, 149 dead so far in these attacks on Ramadan. I gave you the numbers from last year. So why is it that in this 9th lunar month that Ramadan has become a time for the escalation of violence when historically that hasn't always been the case? Well, let me go back to Dr. Jim Dennison for just a minute, and then we'll get into some other issues, because I want to talk about Sharia law and a few other topics that are relevant to what we're dealing with here in the United States. But he points out that Ramadan is the 9th month in the Islamic calendar, and Muslims believe that Muhammad received the first of his series of revelations that ultimately became the Quran in the 17th day of Ramadan in the year AD 610. For this reason, the month has always been holy, he points out, and the month begins 11 days earlier each year on the solar calendar. And this year, of course, it goes from May 26th to June 24th. So we're right kind of in the middle of it right now. During this month, Jim Dennison says, Muslims fast from their first prayer of the day at dawn to their fourth just after sunset. They also refrain from smoking and sexual relations during the day. They pray more fervently during this time. Their increased fervor is not just to honor the month, it is also to receive greater rewards for themselves. He says Muhammad is believed to have preached a sermon on Ramadan in which he said, quote, "Whoever performs an obligatory deed in this month shall receive the reward of performing 7 obligations at any other time." A Taliban spokesman recently stated, "Our fight is jihad and our obligatory worship, and every obligatory act of worship has 70 times more reward in Ramadan." Okay, once you understand that, it's one thing to be involved in a suicide attack or and some kind of jihadist attack at any time of the year, but it's supposedly rewarded 70 times more during Ramadan, which is exactly why Dr. Jim Dennison said we can expect further attacks this month as radical Islamists seek reward in heaven for committing atrocities on earth. But Ramadan is also an important time, he says, for Christians to intercede for Muslims and especially for jihadists. As Muslims focus more intensely on prayer and worship, many are seeing visions and dreams of Jesus. And we've talked about with Joel Rosenberg, with Michael Yosef, who we just mentioned a minute ago. Steve called in and mentioned about him, in which we are seeing just a significant number of Muslims coming to know the Lord. We've had Tom Doyle on the program recently in his book, first his earlier book, Killing Christians, and then his more recent one, Through the Fire, really talking about this as well. And so Jim Dennison uses the illustration that we have in our Bibles. Saul of Tarsus was committed to killing Christians until he met Christ in Acts 9. He says it's vital that we pray for these terrorists from Islam to experience the same transformation. F.B. Meyer believed that the greatest tragedy of life is not unanswered prayer, but unoffered prayer. And so he is really encouraging us as we begin to think about some of these issues to begin to pray for those who are involved in some kind of jihadist act and pray for them as well. So let me, if I can, take a break. When we come back, I'm going to take some more phone calls and give you a chance to join our conversation. But what I want to also deal with is why our leaders in this country, and especially some of the leaders there in England, simply refuse to address some of these issues of terrorist Islam. And I want to pull from a very good speech that was given a while back by Andrew McCarthy at Hillsdale, in which he explained what he ran up against when he was actually trying to prosecute the first terrorist attack against the Twin Towers, the World Trade Center. That was the Blind Sheikh. And so we want to get into that. I also want to talk about what this would mean in terms of Sharia law, because sometimes people say, well, how can we begin to identify some of these jihadists? And I think one way we can identify them is also to begin to understand what's in their hearts and minds. And we've had some very effective surveys that have been done, primarily by the Pew Research Center, to help us understand what many Muslims believe. We spent a little bit of time last Wednesday talking about that with Steve Cable, but I'm going to get into that as well. And we'll take some more of your phone calls this last half hour, an open line, 1-800-351-1212. Then we'll talk about this interview that was done with Vladimir Putin on NBC News. Also, some of the reaction to Kathy Griffin, the reaction to the issue of withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accords. We have a lot to talk about, and we'll do that right after these important messages.
Does point of view make any difference? I think Dr. Eric Walsh would say it does. Dr. Walsh was fired from his job as District Health Director for the state of Georgia, not because of anything he did or failed to do on the job, but because of sermons he preached in his local church. What does that have to do with point of view? Jeremy Dyes of First Liberty represented Dr. Walsh, and in February, the state of Georgia paid a large settlement for their religious discrimination. And Jeremy Dyes became an attorney specializing in defending religious liberty greatly because of what he learned listening to Point of View Radio as a child. That is the kind of difference you make when you support the Truth Team, but we can't make that difference without your help. Become a partner today in this important mission of speaking truth in love. Join the Truth Team at pointofview.net/team. Choose your giving level, stretch a bit, and please do it today. Or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/team. or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention tomorrow we're going to continue some of the conversation here. John Smerick will be with us in the first half hour of the first hour and spend a little bit of time looking at the reaction that many people have had around the world, but even in the academic world, to the decision by President Donald Trump to withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Accords. We're going to also be talking with Dr. Everett Piper, who is the president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University, about some of these issues on campus in terms of safe spaces and intolerance and civility. And then Jay Richards will be with us as we spend just a little bit of time with him talking about yesterday being Pentecost Sunday, and this has led to a lot of people saying, well, you know, if you look at the early Christians, they held property in common, so isn't that communism? So shouldn't we as Christians endorse communism and socialism? So we've got a lot to cover with them. Don't forget, of course, our Millennial Roundtable will be Wednesday. Then we're going to be talking with Robert Knight on Thursday, as well as Gary Bauer on Thursday. And so we're going to have quite a bit to cover there. And then John Stonestreet will be with us in the second hour. And then, of course, we have our Friday roundtable. So we have quite a week scheduled of guests as well as topics. Let's go back to the phones and give some of you a chance to join our conversation. Listening online from California, David, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Oh, nice. Yeah, we've got a nice day out here, Kerby. You know, are you familiar with one of the old laws of Moses called Jubilee?
Yes, I sure am.
Well, I think that's going to be the solution here. If you think about it, the people of the Middle East have been chopped into, 100 years ago, they were colonies of England and France and whatnot, and they finally broke free, but the kings and princes were furious, so they've been financially attacking them for years. The oil gave them a certain revenue stream, and the people never got a piece of the action while the Sultan sat on top and,
That's right.
and carved everything up. So when you start looking at Jubilee is that idea, just like in a Monopoly game, when you figure out that somebody's cheating, you just close down the game and you start over, a redeal. That's what Jubilee is all about. Moses did not believe that money was a creation of man. Money was not a creation of God. Moses felt that it was a creation of man, and it could not have children. And interest rates, basically, is when money has children. The laws of God are the laws of physics. For every action, there's a separate and equal reaction. And when you get into money, say having interest rates, there's a separate and equal reaction plus interest. Well, that's like a perpetual motion machine, and that's impossible. So people of the world have been eaten alive by fake economics for hundreds of years. And in the case of the Middle East, they're carving it up again because they're starting to frack in the Middle East, and what people had as a farm or a village now is very desired by various oil corporations. They want to pack that gas into a pipeline and run it straight across Syria. And there are dozens of pipelines in the works, and Syria wants these companies to pay toll, and the companies say, screw you, we're going to just call out the Marines. So that's what this is all about. They're refugees because they're in a village that has a lot of gas underneath them. And they're being driven off the land. And these incidents, they're corporate wars. They're no longer, to look at it as Ramadan is foolish. It's simply corporations that are carving up the world, and people are in the way, so they call out the Marines to chase them off.
Well, I certainly recognize that corporations are part of the problem and part of the issue, and certainly the maldistribution of income. But I do believe that there is an ideological component, and it certainly is radical Islam. But let me take some more phone calls, because I think some of the rest of you would like to address this issue of how to deal with radical Islam and what we can or should do in this country or in other countries around the world. Dan, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you very much, Kerby. Yeah, my point is that there's 4 verses in the Bible that speak of Antichrist, 3 in 1 John and 1 in 2 John. And those verses define Antichrist as anyone who denies that Jesus is the Christ, or in some translations it says Messiah. We know that it means the anointed of God, the Son of God. Islam, as a religious ideology, denies that truth. And in fact, in Islam, if you profess Christ, that is to apostatize from Islam, and it brings the death penalty. So this is primarily a spiritual battle of truth. And I believe the only way this can be addressed is by educating, witnessing, praying, trying to reach Muslims with this truth, because their ideology states that if they die in the process of killing infidels, they will inherit eternal life. So it's a demonic, and it's a perfect storm if you look at it. In our current political climate, it's almost impossible to talk about this from a religious ideology without bringing in the ire of the left and lots of people, even on the right.
Yeah, because you're right. The ultimate solution for all of this is the gospel, obviously, because even though we can try to work with moderate Muslims, and I'm going to bring some of them on the program so you can have a chance to hear from them, you're already sort of dealing with the difficulty of the fact that they're seen as apostate. Encouraging thing that I can see right now are the number of Muslims who are becoming Christians and actually beginning to understand that they have been involved in a false religion. So, Dan, I appreciate your phone call.
Can I get one more point in, Kerby?
One more point.
There is a ministry in Texas called Iran Alive. It's power. They've been ministry is to send the gospel over satellite directly in and an internet presence and a 24-hour call line. And they're preaching the gospel in the native language of Farsi into those areas from Texas. And they're seeing multitudes coming to faith in Christ and choosing to remain in Iran to then witness to others, even at the expense of their own lives. And their vision and their I cannot think of the name of the founder of the ministry, but he's called the Billy Graham of Islam. And their hope is to see Islam, or at least Iran, converted to Christ through the efforts of their ministry, and the Lord blessing that, and then opening up avenues of ministries through people who have been converted through their message.
Well, let's see if we can get Dr. Hamoz Shariat on, and we certainly could talk about that.
That's his name, yeah.
IranAliveMinistries.org. I'm very familiar with it, and matter of fact, friends of mine have been on the program, and they even talked about having me on the program, but we'll have them on this one. How's about that? And then we'll see.
That would be great.
But he is oftentimes referred to as the Billy Graham of Iran, Dr. Hamoz Shariat, and so I think that will be helpful for you as well.
Good. Well, thank you so much for taking my call.
Will, thank you so very much. Let me, for just a few minutes then, get back to a point that David was making, and especially Dan was making, because when we talk about this, we've got to understand that today, even though there are a lot of Muslims who are probably more moderate and in many cases probably are not terrorists, it's what's in their minds that we need to pay attention to. And so a commentary that is going to come out next Monday, so it's a week from today, or maybe it's a week from tomorrow, I guess, is one that I've put together from the Pew Research Center. They actually surveyed 40,000 Muslims in 39 countries concerning things like Sharia law. Now, let's for just a minute look at the two countries where the United States has been most involved. They found, for example, if you go to Afghanistan, 99% law of the country. Or if you go to Iraq, 91% do. So you can see that this is a difficulty. You already have kind of this mindset of Sharia, and of course you know what Sharia might mean, because that means that a man has more standing in front of a court than a woman, that various kinds of capital offenses are used, and cutting off hands usually, and all sorts of other things we can go through. And the difficulty we've had for so long is it's really hard to bring any kind of democratic values to a country where the people believe in Sharia law, not that something like the Constitution should be the law of the land. And so this is a challenge when we go overseas. But then when you come back to this country, you have many Muslims who are themselves still bringing those ideas here, and that makes it difficult as well to have cohesion. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after these important messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Governor Bill Haslam of Tennessee has signed into law a measure protecting the religious liberty of Tennessee's student athletes. The new law allows parents to opt their students out of participation in an athletic contest if the event is on an official school holiday, observed day of worship, or religious holiday. Moreover, it sets the authority aright by explaining that school officials may not require a student to attend an athletic event over the parent's objection. Some wonder how necessary such a measure is. They argue that schools already respect the religious choices of student athletes and do not punish those students who, for religious reasons, sit out of scheduled contests. That, I suppose, is a debate for the ages. Whether athletes should participate on holy days is not a new issue. Just watch the classic movie Chariots of Fire as but one example. Nonetheless, it is good to see the state of Tennessee explicitly stating that its school districts should be mindful that there are things to be respected of higher importance than sports. Athletics can teach students much about life, diligence, and teamwork, but life balance is a critical element taught by sports in school as well. Today's student athletes are tomorrow's business leaders who may be required to accommodate the religious practices of employees. Let us hope they learn the delicate balance of freedom well. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join a conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me, for just a minute, take one or two more phone calls, and we'll get into a couple of other issues that I think you certainly need to know more about. We'll go first to Georgia on the Good News Network. Ken, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, I just wanted to say that Christianity, Christendom, as it were, is a kingdom, and Islam is a kingdom. And it's sort of like Moses throwing down his, staff, and it became a snake, and the other ones in Egypt threw down theirs, and God's rod, God's serpent, then ate the other ones. And it symbolized eating up the other kingdoms. And the greater kingdom is the one that wins, and they're both based on different beliefs, and they're going in different directions. And Christians should know that the kingdom of God is based on Christ and on righteousness. The other one, Islam, they probably think that it's based on righteousness, but from what I can tell, it's based on self-righteousness.
And self-work, and it's a works-oriented theology, ultimately, because you never are sure whether or not you've done enough to merit favor before Allah, and so it is definitely one with uncertainty and all sorts of other issues. So one of the things that I think, as we mentioned just a minute ago with Dan, is the ultimate answer to this is the gospel, but we still have to live in a world with people that disagree with us theologically, so I still think that anything we can do to join and link arms with individuals that would want to tamp down and begin to address the virulent ideology of Islam would be a good thing, which brings me to another one of the commentaries, which you'll have a chance to hear next week, in which I tell the story from Andrew McCarthy, and he gave a speech a while back at Hillsdale College, and I thought I would repeat it because if you're not familiar with Andrew McCarthy, he's been on this program with us before. He is the one that was leading the prosecution of the terrorist cell that bombed the World Trade Center the first time back in 1993. Well, interestingly enough, he's the prosecutor here, and he had government officials look him in the eye and say that he should read nothing into the fact that all the men in this terrorist cell were Muslims. And Andrew McCarthy's like, what? I mean, this isn't just an accidental correlation. These individuals were actually Muslims, and they were following and acting upon Muslim teaching. And so the officials were trying to explain back in the 1990s that these actions weren't representative of Islam. Well, Andrew McCarthy didn't take that at face value. He said, if nothing else, what I need to do is do my own research because I'm going to prosecute these individuals and I need to understand what they're going to say in a court of law and I need to understand how to win this case. And he was disturbed by the fact that they were portraying the leader of the terrorist cell, who is Omar Abdul Rahman, as a wanton killer and an unbalanced lunatic. But Andrew McCarthy, when he did his research, said he was anything but. He was a globally renowned scholar in Islam. He had a doctorate in Islamic jurisprudence from a major university in Egypt. And so that really kind of presented Andrew McCarthy with a real problem because he needed to know enough about Islamic interpretation in order to press the case, because he really wanted to try to find some inconsistencies between what the Quran teaches and what the leader of this terrorist cell was actually teaching. But what he found was just the opposite. He found that every time that Omar Abdul Rahman quoted the Quran or other Islamic sources, that would be the Quran or the Hadith, or even some of the clerical interpretations of those documents, he said, quote, when he said the scriptures commanded Muslims to strike terror in the hearts of Islam's enemies, the scriptures backed him up. When he said that Allah enjoined all Muslims to wage war against Islamic law was established throughout the world, again, the scriptures backed him up. And so this is where Andrew McCarthy, as we have quoted from him before, said, we're not doing ourselves a favor by saying that this travel ban is not a ban on Islam. It's not there, because a lot of times individuals trying to defend it will say, well, it's not religious. Well, in one sense it isn't, but in the other sense it is. It is against a certain kind of religious interpretation, which he calls Sharia supremacism, or the idea of being using supreme ideas of Sharia law. And so he found and discovered this flaw in the oft-repeated argument that Muslim terrorists were perverting the religion of Islam because they're accurately quoting the verses. But at the same time, we need to understand that not all Muslims are terrorists. We know that many of them will contextualize those. They're peace-loving individuals. We meet them in our markets. We work with them. We see them on college campuses. But at the same time, we can't just continue to say, well, these people are not Muslim because they're using Muslim ideas to try to promote the actions that just took place this weekend in London. Let's take another phone call real quickly. We'll go to Alabama this time, listening online. Ken, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, Kerby. I just wanted to throw out something real quick, and I know you probably can't respond to this until you see the YouTube video. And there's a little URL shortcut where you can easily get to this video. If you'll type in your computer tiny URL, that's URL as in Uniform Resource Locator, fancy way of saying an internet address, but tinyurl.com and the right-hand slash mark, and then Chuck Missler, MISSLER 666, Chuck Missler 666. That'll take you to a 13-minute YouTube video where Dr. Missler explains we may have misinterpreted Revelation 13:8.
The mark of the beast. Yeah. Go ahead.
The mark of the beast, right, exactly. He said it may actually say, he can recompile it for you and tell you that there's going to be a group of people in the end times, and that group of, there's going to be a problem, and they will be known as, quote, in the name of Allah, unquote. And he documents everything in this little 13-minute video in a stunning PowerPoint presentation.
Well, I've got that in front of me here, and again, he's pulling some of that, of course, from Revelation 13. We've had Chuck Missler on until he got a little bit too old that he said, I really just am a little bit uncertain about doing live radio, but
I know he's getting up in years.
But if nothing else, he's one of the smartest guys in the room whenever he talks, so we'll have a chance to look at that and let some other people look at it as well. So I really appreciate you pointing us to that, and maybe we'll get to that in the future.
Thank you, Kerby.
Thank you. We're just simply out of time, and let me just mention that there are a few things we didn't get to. One of those that you might want to read is the last article there, America doesn't have a successor, because ever since the United States, through President Trump, have decided to pull out of the Paris Climate Accord, there have been other people saying, well, now that's it. The United States is no longer going to be a place where people will study science. And I love what this particular writer points out. Well, okay, just look at the number of Chinese students in science who decide to still come to the United States to study science here in the United States. And we're no longer the leader of the Western world. So they're saying, well, maybe Angela Merkel is. Don't think so. That the title of it is, America doesn't have a successor. Everybody's saying, well, this is the end of the nation. This is the end of the world. This is the end of America's leadership. This is the end of teaching science in America. Not really. And so if nothing else, I thought you might want to read that article, which is very well written. We'll get to some of the other issues tomorrow, and certainly we will have a chance as we talk with Jay Richards, John Smirek, and Emmett Piper to get into some of those issues as well. Take the time today to go to the website, pointofview.net. You'll see 4 different articles, and each one of those has some great information on some of the things we've been talking about, and we'll do our best to follow up on some of the great suggestions for future programs that some of you had a chance to give to us. I want to thank Andrew and Tina and Melissa for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
A 2013 survey asked people around the world whether sex without marriage is morally wrong. Every country where more than 90% said, yes, it's morally wrong, Islamic. The worst two, tied at 6% saying it's wrong, France and Germany, the nations of Calvin and Luther. Catholic Italy, 11%. Simply sad. The United States, well, 31%. Not even 1 in 3 thinks extramarital sex is morally wrong. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.